Let me tell you about a spring morning in the Pecos Valley of southeastern New Mexico, somewhere south of Roswell, where the chilly fields stretch out flat and the irrigation ditches cut clean silver lines across the red dirt. The year was 1989. The morning was the kind they get out there in late March, when the air is still cool but the sun already has a hard white edge to it, and a man can stand on the bed of his pickup truck and see for 2 miles in any direction. On that morning, the 3 farmers who had pulled their trucks off along the shoulder of the old county road that ran past the Markle place could not believe what they were seeing. Every farm up and down that stretch of the valley was being worked hard. It was planting season for chili and alfalfa, and the window was tight. Tractors were running from before sunup until after dark. The smell of diesel and turned earth was thick in the air, and the irrigation canal that came off the Pecos was running full, brown and patient, feeding ditches that branched out across 35 and 40 and 50 acre parcels of valley bottom. Every farmer with half a brain knew that water in the Pecos Valley was the most precious thing a person could have, and you did not waste an inch of ground that could be reached by that water. You plowed everything. You leveled everything. You planted everything. That was the deal you made with the desert. But there on the Markle place, 19-year-old Sadie Markle was driving her grandfather's old Ford tractor in long, deliberate passes across her 35 acres. And she was steering it carefully around 2 long strips of ground along the edges of her 2 main irrigation ditches. Each strip was about 40 feet wide. Each one ran the full length of the field. And each one was covered in a thick matted growth of old sacaton bunch grass and saltbush, and 4-winged saltbush that had crept back in over the years when nobody had the time or the equipment to fight it. She circled those strips, she left them, and then she kept right on planting, as if she had done nothing strange at all. The 3 men on the road watched her finish a pass and turn the tractor at the far end of the field. Hollis Burnett, who had farmed the next place over for 38 years, took off his straw hat and ran a hand through his thin gray hair. "Now what in the world," he said, "is that child doing?" His neighbor, Wendell Crane, was leaning on the tailgate of his Chevrolet with his arms folded across his chest. He smiled the kind of smile a man smiles when he sees something he cannot believe. "She's leaving good ground to the weeds, that's what she's doing." The third man, Earl Padgett, did not say anything for a long moment. He just shook his head once, slow, the way a man does when he has decided that what he is seeing is not worth wasting words on. They watched her finish the field. They watched her park the tractor by the equipment shed, climb down without ever looking their way, and walk back toward the small adobe house where her grandfather sat on the porch in a wheelchair, a blanket across his lap even in the warming air. She did not hurry. She did not look defiant. She just walked, quiet, the way she always did. Nobody on the road said it out loud, but every one of them was thinking the same thing. The Markle farm was already in trouble. It had been in trouble since old Frank Markle, her grandfather, had his stroke the previous winter and lost the use of his right side. Now the only one left to work that ground was this slip of a girl, 19 years old, 5 feet 3 inches if she stretched, and on the very first planting of her first season alone, she was choosing to leave 2 strips of irrigated valley bottom unplanted at the edges of her ditches. What did she know that they did not? Or was she simply making a mistake that the long, hot summer ahead would prove costly? If you have ever been underestimated because of your age, or your size, or because the people around you decided long ago that you could not possibly know something they did not, take a moment to like this video and to subscribe to the channel. Stories like the one I am about to tell you remind us that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only one who has been paying attention. What every farmer in the lower Pecos Valley understood, but had long since stopped thinking carefully about, was that the wind out there did not behave the same way the wind behaved in other parts of the country. The Pecos Valley sits in a long, shallow trough that runs north to south, and the dry westerly winds that come pouring down off the Llano Estacado, the high flat plains that begin just over the line in Texas, can build up speed over hundreds of miles of open country before they ever reach the irrigated bottoms. When the air gets dry enough, and the temperature spread between the high plains and the valley floor gets wide enough, those winds can lift the top inch of a freshly plowed field and carry it away in a single afternoon. Older farmers remembered the dust storms of the early 1950s. Younger ones did not. The question Sadie Markle had begun to ask herself the previous winter in the long, quiet evenings after she had put her grandfather to bed and sat at the kitchen table with a single lamp on was whether what her great-grandfather had written down 40 years before about wind and grass and the way a field protects itself might still be true. The Pecos Valley of southeastern New Mexico has long been one of the most productive irrigated agricultural regions in the American Southwest. Beginning in the late 1800s, settlers diverted water from the Pecos River through a network of canals to grow alfalfa, cotton, chili peppers, and pecans on the otherwise dry valley floor. The region is unusually vulnerable to wind erosion because of its position downwind of the Llano Estacado, the high plains of West Texas, where dry westerly winds can build up enormous speed before sweeping down into the lower valley. Severe dust events have shaped local farming practices for over a century. Part 2. The Notebooks in the Shed. Sadie Markle had grown up on that 35-acre piece of valley bottom, the way children grow up in places that ask a lot of them. Her mother had passed when Sadie was 11, of a quick cancer that no one in the family liked to talk about. Her father had left long before that, when she was small, gone off to work the oil fields out east near Hobbs and never really come back. After her mother's funeral, it had been Sadie and her grandfather, Frank Markle, working the place together. The two of them moving through the seasons in a routine that did not need a lot of words. Frank had taught her how to read the ditches. He had taught her how to set the gates. He had taught her how to walk a field at dawn and know by the smell of the soil whether it needed water or whether it had had enough. By the time she was 16, she could run the whole farm with him. And by the time she was 18, she was running most of it herself. She did not announce that. She just did what needed doing. That was how her grandfather had raised her. When Frank had his stroke 2 days after Christmas in the winter of 1988, the doctors in Roswell told Sadie that he would not work the land again. He could speak, slowly, and he could think clearly, but the right side of his body had gone soft and would not come back. Sadie brought him home in the truck the day after New Year's, settled him in the front room where he could see the road, and went out to the equipment shed to figure out what she was going to do about 35 acres of irrigated chili and alfalfa ground. With planting season 11 weeks away, that was when she found the notebooks. They were in a wooden crate in the back corner of the shed, behind a stack of feed sacks that had not been moved in 20 years. The crate had been her great-grandfather's. Alfred Markle had homesteaded that piece of valley bottom in the early 1920s, dug the first lateral ditch off the main canal with his own hands and a borrowed team of mules, and farmed the place until his heart gave out in the summer of 1958. Sadie had heard his name her whole life but had never met him. What she found inside the crate, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with twine, were 11 leather-bound field notebooks, each one filled in his small, careful pencil handwriting. They covered every season he had worked the place, from 1923 to the year before he died. She brought them inside that night and read them at the kitchen table while her grandfather slept. They were not what she had expected. They were not just records of planting dates and rainfall and yields. Alfred Markle had been a watcher of the land. He sketched the shapes of his fields. He drew arrows showing how the wind moved across them on the worst days. He recorded the temperature of the soil at 6 inches down on the morning of every planting. And in the notebooks from the early 1950s, when the second wave of the Dust Bowl had reached down into the Pecos Valley, he had written something that stopped her cold. She read it 3 times. She copied it onto a fresh page in her own spiral notebook. And then she read it again. "The strips along the ditches where I have let the sacaton stand," he had written in March of 1954. "Those are the strips that hold the soil when the wind comes hard out of the west. The grass takes the wind first. It breaks it down to nothing at the level of the ground. The dust does not move past the strip. The water in the ditch stays clear. Wendell Crane laughs at me about it. He will not laugh in 20 years. That had been her great-grandfather's neighbor. Sadie had to read the name twice before she understood. Wendell Crane on the road was that man's son. What Alfred Markle had been doing, without ever using the modern words for it, was leaving wind buffer strips along his irrigation ditches. Tall, deep-rooted native grass at the upwind edge of a field breaks the speed of the wind at ground level, drops the dust load it is carrying, and protects everything downwind of it. The Conservation Service called it a vegetative wind barrier now. Alfred had figured it out on his own, by watching. By being a man with no electricity and no television, and nothing to do at the end of a long day but think about what he had seen that day with his eyes. Sadie spent the rest of that winter reading those notebooks and walking her fields with a tape measure. She matched her great-grandfather's diagrams to the shape of her ground as it was now. She found, in the records of the worst dust events of the early 50s, exactly which strips he had left standing and exactly how wide each one had been. She drove into Roswell one afternoon, sat down at a computer in the library, and pulled up everything the Soil Conservation Service had ever published on wind erosion in the Pecos Valley. The technical bulletins from 1986 and 1987 described in their dry, careful language exactly what Alfred had described in his notebook in 1954. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. She did not tell her grandfather, not at first. She just made her plan, sketched it out on the back of a feed bill, and waited for the ground to be ready in March. When she finally did show her grandfather the notebook one night in early February, he read the passage about Wendell Crane's father, and he was quiet for a long time. Then he reached out with his good hand and tapped the page once. "Do it," he said. "Do what he says." April came hot and dry. The chili sprouted in long, even rows. The alfalfa came up clean. And along the edges of the two ditches, the sacaton grass and saltbush stood thick and untouched, looking exactly like what every neighbor on the road said it was: wasted ground. Once in early May, Wendell Crane drove past on his way to town, slowed his pickup, and shouted something through the window that Sadie did not quite catch, but that ended in laughter. She raised one hand. She kept walking. Inside her chest, something quiet was building that was not quite pride. It was more like the feeling of watching an old equation begin to balance out, line by line, after 40 years on a shelf. Vegetative wind barriers, sometimes called field windbreaks or shelter belts, are strips of perennial grass, shrubs, or trees planted at the upwind edge of cultivated fields to reduce wind speed at ground level. They protect soil from erosion, hold moisture in the upper layers, and shield emerging crops from sandblast injury. Native bunch grasses such as alkali sacaton and four-wing saltbush, common across the lower Pecos Valley, have deep root systems that anchor sandy soils. Farmers in the Southwest used these strips informally for generations before agricultural extension services formally documented their effects in the 1970s and 80s. Part 3. The wind out of the west. Now, here is the part of the story that matters. The forecast started shifting in the second week of June. The Pecos Valley had already been dry. April had brought only one good rain. May had brought none. By the 1st of June, the irrigation canal was still running, but the ground between the rows of chili was the color of old brick, and the alfalfa was making it on ditch water alone. The temperature spread between the high plains over in Texas, and the valley floor was widening day by day. The boys at the Weather Service office in Midland were issuing advisories about elevated fire danger and high wind events. The older farmers in the valley, the ones who could still remember the bad years, started watching the western horizon in the afternoons. Sadie was watching too. She had her great-grandfather's notebook open on the kitchen table for 3 days running. The pages weighted down with a coffee cup so the wind that worked its way through the screen door would not move them. Alfred had written, in June of 1953, "When the dew burns off by 8 in the morning, and the wind comes from the west by 10, you have 1 day, maybe 2, before it lifts the topsoil." Sadie was watching the dew. She was watching the windsock she had tied to the corner post of the equipment shed. By the morning of June 14th, the dew was gone by 7. By 10, the windsock was standing out straight to the east, snapping like a flag at a courthouse on the 4th of July. She moved fast. She covered the truck. She brought the chickens into the barn. She rolled up the awnings on the porch where her grandfather sat, helped him inside, closed every window in the house, and stuffed wet rags into the cracks of the door frames. Then she went out to the field, walked the length of both ditch strips one more time, checked the depth of the sacaton root mass with the toe of her boot, and walked back to the house. There was nothing else for her to do. She had done everything she was going to do back in March. The wind came hard that afternoon. By 3 o'clock, the sky to the west had gone the color of weak coffee. By 4, it was the color of a brick wall. The Texas high plains had given up their topsoil, and the lower Pecos Valley was about to receive it, along with whatever the lower valley itself could not hold down. The dust front moved across the Markle place at something like 50 miles an hour. It blotted out the sun. It cut visibility in the yard to less than 10 feet. Sadie sat on the floor in the front room with her grandfather, their backs against the cool adobe wall. and listened to the sound of grit hitting the windows like buckshot. Frank held her hand with his good hand. He did not speak. He did not need to. The storm blew for the rest of that afternoon, all night, and into the next morning. When the wind finally dropped off sometime around 10 on the morning of June 15th, Sadie pulled a bandana up over her nose and walked out into a yard that had been changed. There were drifts of pale red sand against the north side of the equipment shed that were 2 feet deep. The bird bath was full of dust. The water trough was full of dust. Her tractor had a 1/4 inch of fine red powder on every flat surface. She walked past all of it and down the lane to the edge of the lower field, and that is where she stopped. The strip of sacaton grass along the upwind ditch had taken the storm full in the face. The grass had been bent flat. The saltbush along the edge looked like it had been beaten with hammers. And in the open dirt right at the base of the strip, on the windward side, there was a long drift of pale sand piled almost 3 feet high against the grass. The topsoil that had come off of who knows how many fields to the west of her stopped right there at the line where her great-grandfather had said it would stop. The ditch behind the strip was still clear. The chili rows behind the strip were still standing. They were stressed. They were dusted, but they were alive. By comparison, and Sadie did not have to walk far to make the comparison, Hollis Burnett's chili field on the next place over had taken the storm without a buffer of any kind. 2/3 of his young plants had been cut off at the soil line by blowing sand. His main lateral ditch had 2.5 feet of sand in it. He would not be irrigating again for a month, not until he could get a crew out there to dig it clean. Wendell Crane had lost most of an alfalfa cutting that had been almost ready to mow. Earl Padgett, whose place sat right on the windward edge of the valley, had watched the top inch of his field go past his kitchen window in a brown wall. He would tell people later, when he could talk about it, that it was the worst thing he had ever seen on his own land. The Pecos Valley had not had a wind event like that since 1956. The crops Sadie had planted, on the 35 acres her family had been farming for 3 generations. The place everyone in the valley knew sat right in the worst of the wind alley, had come through with less damage than any comparable piece of ground for 10 miles in any direction. Sadie stood at the edge of the lower field in the thinning haze on the morning after the storm and looked at the line where the damage stopped. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter than that, a kind of gratitude turned backward through time, toward a man she had never met, whose handwriting she had been listening to all spring. The line had held. The grass had done its work. Her great-grandfather had been right, and the proof of it was sitting in a pale drift along the upwind ditch, exactly where he had said it would sit. Educational note. The dust storms of the American Southwest in the 1950s were a continuation, in many regions, of the conditions that caused the original Dust Bowl of the 1930s. New Mexico's lower Pecos Valley experienced major wind erosion events through the early 50s, particularly during the severe drought years of 1953 through 1956. Farmers in the region developed practical wind erosion controls during that period, including vegetative strips, contour plowing, and the preservation of native bunch grass along ditch and field edges. Many of these practices were quietly abandoned in the decades that followed, as irrigation expanded and dust events became less frequent, until they returned. Part 4. The Notebook on the Table. They came one at a time over the next 2 weeks, not in a group, not with any kind of fanfare, not with the energy of men coming to apologize. They came the way farmers come to a neighbor's place when they need to understand something quietly, with their boots still red from their own ruined fields, and their hats in their hands. Hollis Burnett was the first. He came on a Wednesday morning, 6 days after the storm, driving slow up the lane in his old GMC. Sadie saw him from the porch before he reached the house. He climbed out of the truck and stood for a moment looking at the strip of sacaton along the ditch, at the long pale drift of stopped sand at its windward base, at the clean chili rows above it. He stood there for a long time. Then he walked over to where Sadie was waiting in the shade of the equipment shed, took his hat off, and held it in both hands in front of him. "I need you to tell me," he said, "what you did here." It was not a question, exactly. It was a man asking to understand why his neighbor's ground had held when his own had given way. He had lost most of 2 acres of chili seedlings, and the kind of loss that does not come out in a man's voice. It sits in the way he stands. 40 feet wide, Sadie said. My great-grandfather's note said 30 was the minimum for this part of the valley. I went wider to be safe. Hollis looked back at the strip for a long moment. What kind of grass? Alkali sacaton, four-wing saltbush, some blue grama that came back on its own. You don't plant it. You just stop plowing it and let it stand. Wendell Crane came 2 days later. He drove up the lane in the middle of the afternoon, parked his Chevrolet by the gate, and walked slowly toward where Sadie was standing. He did not say anything at all for a moment. Then he said, "My daddy used to talk about your great-granddaddy. He said the man was the most patient farmer he ever knew." Sadie did not answer that. She just nodded. Wendell looked down at his own boots. "I was wrong about you," he said. "I want you to know I know that." Earl Padgett came on the third day after Wendell. He was the quiet one, the one who had only shaken his head from the road in March. He stood at the edge of the strip for almost 20 minutes without saying a word. When he finally turned to her, he said only, "Can I see the notebook?" She brought it out to him and let him sit on the porch step with it for nearly an hour, turning the pages slowly with one finger, reading her great-grandfather's small, careful handwriting. When he handed it back, his eyes were wet, though he would not have said so. The county extension agent drove out from Roswell on the following Thursday. He walked the strip with a tape measure and a clipboard, asked Sadie questions she answered without impatience or condescension, took photographs of the windward drift and the protected rows above it. She showed him the notebooks. She showed him the conservation bulletins from 1986 that she had printed out at the library and cross-referenced against Alfred's observations from 1954. The extension agent did not laugh. Nobody who came to the Markle place that summer laughed about anything. They stood in the field, serious and attentive, and they listened to a 19-year-old woman explain a thing that had been sitting in a wooden crate in an equipment shed for 31 years, waiting for somebody to read it. Her grandfather was on the porch the evening the extension agent left, wrapped in his blanket despite the dry June warmth, watching the county road the way he had watched it for 40 years. Sadie sat down on the step beside him and told him how the conversation had gone. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "Your great-grandfather would have known you." It was not a complicated thing to say, but it was the right thing. And it landed in her chest the way the right things do. Alfred Markle had farmed that ground in a time before deep wells and big diesel pumps had made the desert feel like it could be tamed for good. Before the green years of the 1960s and 70s had made his careful watching seem like the habit of a man with too much time on his hands. He had recorded what he saw with the patience of a man who knew the desert always came back, eventually, and that the only thing worth writing down was the truth of what the ground actually did. Then he had died, and his notebooks had gone into a wooden crate in a shed, and the crate had sat behind a stack of feed sacks for 31 years, until his great-granddaughter found a reason to open it. The next spring, 4 farms along that stretch of the road left strips of native grass along their windward ditches. The county extension office held a workshop on vegetative wind barriers in the lower Pecos Valley that drew farmers from 3 counties. 2 years after the storm of June 1989, aerial photographs of the lower Pecos Basin showed more than 2,000 linear feet of new native grass strip where bare field edges had been. None of it would have happened if a 19-year-old woman had not been dismissed as too young and too small to know anything, and had not answered that dismissal not with argument or anger, but with a long, quiet season of careful work, guided by the handwriting of a man most of her neighbors had never met. The desert remembers things if you give it the room to. The people who work it can learn to remember too, but usually only after the wind has come hard one time, and the damage has been counted, and somebody patient enough to have been paying attention all along walks them out into the field and shows them where the line held. Sadie Markle did not set out to prove anyone wrong. She set out to protect a farm and to honor a grandfather she could no longer ask, and a great-grandfather she had never met. In the end, she protected a lot more than that. That summer, every evening after she finished the irrigation and put her grandfather to bed, Sadie sat at the kitchen table under the single lamp with the 11 notebooks stacked beside her elbow. She would read one page. She would copy one observation into her own spiral notebook in her own handwriting beside his. She would close the book. She would drink a half cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour before. And then she would put the cup down beside the open page, the way her great-grandfather had probably done, on the same table, in the same house, 35 years before. And she would go to bed. The notebook stayed open on the table. The cold cup stayed beside it. And in the dark kitchen, When the house was quiet and the wind off the high plains was only a whisper at the screen door, the page was waiting for whoever came next. Knowledge in agricultural communities has historically been passed down through direct apprenticeship, parent to child, neighbor to neighbor, rather than through written record. When that chain is broken by death, migration, or technological change, hard-earned local wisdom can disappear within a single generation. The recovery of older land management practices, often through old journals, oral histories, or extension service archives, has played an important role in sustainable agriculture in the American Southwest. Practices once considered old-fashioned, such as windbreaks, contour cultivation, and native grass buffer strips, are now formally recommended by the United States Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service.